Okay, let's dive right in. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating new study out of The Ohio State University, and honestly, it completely rewrites what we thought we knew about childhood brain development. We are going to explore how two of our most unbelievably sophisticated cognitive skills actually boot up in the mind. If you've ever watched a toddler try to string a sentence together, or suddenly show this surprising flash of deep empathy, well, you've witnessed exactly what we're about to decode in this explainer.
It's a huge, profound question, right? What actually makes us human? For centuries, philosophers and scientists have pointed to our unique cognitive abilities as the great divider between us and the rest of the animal kingdom. Specifically, it comes down to our capacity for complex communication and our deep, intuitive grasp of complicated social dynamics. But how does that uniquely human cognition actually emerge in the brain? Do we start with a blank slate that slowly builds up, or are we born with the architecture already installed?
To answer that, we really need to define a critical piece of jargon: theory of mind. In the psychology and neuroscience worlds, theory of mind, sometimes called mentalizing, is basically your brain's ultimate empathy superpower. It's that cognitive ability to sense, interpret, and genuinely understand how other people are feeling and thinking. It's literally what lets you read a room, pick up on a friend's unspoken sadness, or anticipate how someone's going to react. Alongside spoken language, it is the absolute foundation of human connection.
Now, what's truly wild is how these two superpowers map out in a fully mature adult brain. Both of these skills actually originate from a region called the superior temporal lobe, which sits right around your temples. But they live on totally distinct, opposite sides. Language and spoken words, those are fiercely guarded in the left hemisphere. Meanwhile, theory of mind and mentalizing set up camp in the right hemisphere. They're essentially parallel processors, operating on opposite sides of your head.
So, for the longest time, the leading scientific consensus, the old paradigm basically, was that our developing brains started out as a bit of a disorganized soup. The old theory assumed that in early childhood, the brain areas for language and empathy were just sort of mashed together, heavily overlapping. And the general belief was that as we got older, learned to talk, and socialized more, these regions gradually untangled and specialized into those distinct left and right adult hemispheres we just talked about. But, science is all about testing our assumptions.
Enter researchers Zeynep Saygin and Kelly Hirsch from Ohio State. They set up a genuinely groundbreaking fMRI experiment to see if this whole jumbled brain theory actually held water when subjected to modern, state-of-the-art imaging. They wanted to peer directly inside the developing toddler brain to map these cognitive regions in real time. And let's be real, if you've ever tried to get a 3-year-old to sit perfectly still, you know that putting them in an MRI machine is an incredibly ambitious undertaking.
But to do this correctly, they needed an airtight baseline. So the researchers first took fMRI scans of 28 fully grown adults. They used these scans to essentially double-check what previous science had already established: that in adults, the regions firing for language and theory of mind respond incredibly strongly to targeted stimuli, and they live in completely separate zip codes in the brain. Once they had that adult baseline locked in, they were ready for the real challenge. The main event, the team successfully managed to scan the brains of 42 children, ranging from 9 years old all the way down to just 3 years old. Seriously, capturing the delicate, developing cognitive architecture of a 3-year-old is no small feat. They ran 2 separate fMRI scans on these kids to track exactly what was lighting up in their brains while they processed very different types of incoming information.
And the methodology they used was brilliant. To test language, kids listened to real sentences, which was then compared against a control condition of hearing pure nonsense words. To test theory of mind, they watched silent cartoons specifically designed to evoke empathy and mentalizing. And the control for that? Watching cartoon characters reacting to physical pain. Why physical pain? Well, because reacting to someone stubbing their toe triggers a basic neurological pain response, not the complex, emotional mentalizing you need for true theory of mind.
To get definitive answers, the team utilized some incredible micro-level imaging. We're talking about analyzing the brain across both hemispheres down to the 2 to 3 millimeter level, which is known as the 3D voxel level. Think of a voxel like a tiny 3-dimensional pixel of brain tissue. By zooming in at this microscopic resolution, they can map out precisely which discrete little pockets lit up during the active tasks versus the control tasks. Absolutely zero room for ambiguity.
Which brings us to our first massive plot twist. As lead researcher Kelly Hirsch puts it,
we demonstrate this for the first time in kids. They're really distinct there, which is pretty cool. When they looked at those tiny 3D voxels in the youngest children, the regions responding to language and the regions responding to theory of mind had absolutely zero overlap. None. Even at just 3 years old, these functions were already operating in completely separate areas of the brain.
Okay, so they proved the locations were separate when the kids were actively thinking. But what happens when the brain is just at rest? This is a huge question in neuroscience, because sometimes regions that look totally separate when they're active might actually be deeply tangled up behind the scenes. So to fully put the old jumbled start theory in its grave, the researchers had to transition from the active stimuli tests and look at resting state fMRI data. They needed to see what the brain does when it's literally just idling.
To figure that out, they examined a really cool concept called the connectivity fingerprint. Basically, think of it as the brain's own private social network. It's the unique pattern of how one single region of the brain chats with the rest of the brain in the background. Even when a child is just resting, those little voxels are chattering away with other areas. And how a voxel talks to the rest of the network gives you a massive clue about its specific, deeply ingrained job.
Senior author Zeynep Saigen hits the nail on the head here. She says regions of the brain that are functionally specific should be communicating in a unique way. The big takeaway is that anatomical location isn't everything. Even though they knew these cognitive regions lived in different neighborhoods, studying these connectivity fingerprints let the team see if the actual wiring was fundamentally different from birth or if they were secretly sharing communication lines.
Using predictive modeling on these resting brains, the results came back totally definitive. The communication networks for language and empathy are completely unique. Not only that, but they proved incredibly stable within the exact same child over time. A 3-year-old's brain isn't functionally jumbled at all. There's literally zero evidence that these networks start out tangled up and just sort of pull apart by kindergarten. From the very earliest stages of development, the distinct wiring for talking and the distinct wiring for empathizing are completely separately laid down.
And here is the crazy reverse twist of the whole study. We used to think kids had overlapping networks that separated as they grew up, but the data shows the exact opposite. Kids have completely isolated, distinct networks. It's actually the adults who start to show a little bit of shared network overlap. As we mature, our fully developed language and theory of mind networks start talking to similar regions, basically integrating these two separate skills so we can navigate really complex adult social situations.
When you zoom out for a second, the macro-level impact of this data is huge. It is quite literally rewriting our understanding of early childhood brain architecture and human evolution. It totally shatters this old idea that our advanced communication skills just sort of evolved from a single generic blob of cognition that eventually specialized. Instead, it strongly points to the idea that a human brain comes right out of the box equipped with highly specific, separate hardware for highly specific human tasks.
Zeynep Saigen draws a super powerful conclusion from this. She states that these processors were dissociated very, very early in the evolutionary process, such that we can't even see traces of overlap right now in human development. What that means is, long before modern humans were even walking the earth, our ancient ancestors' brains were already dividing up the labor. They were dedicating one distinct pathway purely for the mechanics of language, and an entirely separate pathway for the magic of understanding another person's mind. So let's quickly recap what we've learned. The micro-level MRI data clearly shows us that language and empathy are hardwired incredibly early. These brain regions start out entirely separate, completely contradicting decades of older developmental theories. They don't start as a jumbled soup, and they don't pull apart over time. Actually, it's the reverse. As we grow into adults, we learn to organically integrate these two finely tuned, entirely distinct tools so we can truly connect with the world around us. Which leaves us with this final, kind of mind-blowing thought to chew on. If the hardware for language and the hardware for empathy are entirely distinct and independently wired into us from day one, how might that change the way we approach early childhood education? How does it change the way we raise the next generation? Because if they aren't just two sides of the same coin, how do we make sure we're best nurturing both?